mean I'll see it.
You know that stretch of the Pine Barrens where the cell service just kind of dies out? It's about 40 miles past the last gas station, where the trees start leaning over the road like they're trying to whisper something to your windshield. I was out there last November, just trying to clear my head after the divorce. I'd rented this cabin that looked decent on the website, but the moment I pulled up, I realized the photos must have been taken 20 years ago. The wood was gray and bloated from the damp, and the forest didn't just surround the place, it felt like it was pressing its weight against the walls. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. You expect crickets or an owl, but it was like the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. I remember sitting on the porch with a beer, looking out into the tree line. The moon was thin, just a silver sliver, and the shadows of the pines were long and jagged. That's when I heard the first sound. It wasn't a snap of a twig or a rustle of leaves. It was a wet, heavy thud, like a sack of raw meat hitting the forest floor from a significant height. I stood up, my heart doing that weird little flutter against my ribs. I thought maybe a deer had fallen, or a dead branch had finally given way. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the mist. I didn't see anything at first, just the vertical lines of the trunks. But then, about 50 yards out, I saw a pale shape rising from the dirt. It didn't stand up like a person does. It uncurled. It looked like a man, but the proportions were slightly off. The arms were too long, the skin a sickly, translucent white that seemed to soak up the light. Before I could even yell out, it scurried into the brush with a speed that made my stomach turn. I didn't sleep that night. I locked every door, even the flimsy interior ones, and sat on the floor with my hunting knife. I told myself it was a bear with mange or some local meth head living in the rough. You try to rationalize things when the truth is too heavy to carry. But the next day, things got worse. I went for a walk, stupid, I know, but I had to see if I was losing my mind. I found the spot where the sound came from. There wasn't a body, but the pine needles were flattened in a perfect circle, and there were these deep, gouged ruts in the bark of the nearest oak tree. The ruts started about 20 feet up and scraped all the way down to the roots, like something had used its claws to slow a vertical descent. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, the woods changed. The wind picked up, and it brought a smell with it. It wasn't just rot, it was sweet, like overripe peaches left to liquefy in the sun, mixed with the metallic tang of old pennies. I was heading back to the cabin when I looked up. That was my mistake. I looked into the canopy. They weren't birds, and they weren't hanging by ropes. They were just there. Dozens of them. Men, women, and things that might have been children once. They were perched on the high branches, their limbs wrapped around the wood like snakes. They were completely naked, their skin stretched tight over their ribs, and their eyes, Jesus, the eyes. They didn't reflect the light, they just swallowed it. They were staring down at me, perfectly still, waiting for the shadows to get long enough. I started to run. My boots were heavy on the frozen mud, and I could hear them. Thud. Thud. Slap. One by one, they were letting go. They weren't climbing down, they were dropping. They hit the ground with that same sickening meat sound, roll once, and then spring up onto all fours. I could hear the snapping of their joints as they adjusted to the ground, a sound like a handful of dry pencils being broken all at once. I barely made it inside and slammed the heavy deadbolt. I pushed the dining table against the door, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Then the scratching started. It wasn't just at the door. It was on the walls. It was on the roof. I could hear their long, yellowed fingernails digging into the cedar shingles. Scritch. 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 And then, a sound that will stay with me until the day I die, the sound of someone trying to mimic a human voice. It was a high, warbling whistle that shaped itself into my name. David. David, come see, the harvest is low. I climbed into the crawl space under the floorboards, dragging a heavy rug over the trapdoor. I sat there in the dark, smelling the damp earth and the rising stench of that sweet rot. Through the gaps in the floor, I saw them enter. Their feet were gray and calloused, the toes elongated and tipped with black claws. They didn't walk, they drifted, their movements fluid and predatory. I watched through a knothole as one of them, a woman with long, matted hair that looked like wet seaweed, picked up my discarded beer can. She didn't look at it. She bit into the aluminum, her teeth grinding through the metal with a screeching sound that made my ears bleed. Then I saw what they were carrying. They hadn't come for me, not yet. They were bringing things in from the woods. They dragged the body of a hiker across the floorboards right above my head. I could hear his fingernails scraping against the wood as he tried to find a grip, his muffled screams bubbling through a throat that had been surgically opened. They weren't eating him. They were prepping him. I heard the sound of wet tearing, the sound of skin being peeled away from muscle, slow and deliberate. They were talking to each other in those clicking, whistling sounds, sounding almost celebratory. I stayed in that crawl space for 2 days. I listened to the sounds of the harvest. I heard the way they cracked the long bones to get to the marrow. I heard the way they hummed a low, vibrating drone as they worked. Every few hours, I hear a heavy thud on the roof as more of them dropped from the sky, bringing back fruit from the deeper woods. The cabin wasn't a shelter anymore, it was a larder. By the third morning, the sounds stopped. I waited for hours, my limbs cramped and screaming, until the sun was high and the woods were silent again. When I finally crawled out, the cabin was a slaughterhouse. But they hadn't left a mess. It was clean. Too clean. The floorboards were scrubbed white, the blood gone, the furniture moved back into place. The only sign they had been there was the smell, that cloying, sweet rot, and the fact that my hunting knife was gone. I ran to my car and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I found a state trooper 2 towns over. I told him everything, shaking and crying like a child. He looked at me with this hollow, tired expression. He didn't ask for a statement. He didn't call for backup. He just leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee, and whispered, "You're lucky, son." Usually, they don't let the witnesses drop. They like to keep the ones that can still scream up in the high branches for winter. I live in the city now. I don't go near parks, and I never, ever look up when I'm under a tree. Because sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the skyscrapers, I can hear that high, warbling whistle calling my name. And I know they're just waiting for the next season to begin.
Next story.
Some debts are paid in skin. Don't look up.
The thing about those high, slanted ceilings is that you never really look at them unless you're trying to find a spider or wondering when you'll finally get around to painting. I used to love that skylight. It was right above the landing on the second floor, a massive pane of reinforced glass that let you see the stars while you walked from the bathroom to the bedroom. It felt modern and open. Now, I can't even look at a window without feeling like my stomach is turning inside out. It started on a Tuesday, one of those thick, humid nights where the air just sits on your skin like a wet wool blanket. The AC in my place had been acting up, so I used the hand crank to crack the skylight open. It only opens about 6 inches, just enough for a breeze, or so I thought. I was sitting downstairs on the sofa, scrolling through my phone, when I heard this sound. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was a wet, sliding noise. Like someone had dropped a raw steak onto a hardwood floor and then dragged it slowly across the surface. I froze. You know that instinct where your brain tries to tell you it's something normal? I tried to convince myself it was a heavy branch hitting the roof, or maybe a fat raccoon scrambling over the shingles. But the sound was coming from inside. It was rhythmic. Shloop, tap. Shloop, tap. It moved from the landing toward the guest bedroom, which I keep closed because it's mostly just boxes and old exercise equipment. I grabbed the heavy mag light I keep in the kitchen drawer, the kind that feels like a lead pipe in your hand, and I started heading up the stairs. The house was silent, except for the humming of the refrigerator downstairs. When I got to the landing, I looked up. The skylight was still open, but the white plastic frame was smeared with something dark. In the dim light of the street lamp outside, it looked like oil. I reached up and touched the edge of the wall. It wasn't oil. It was tacky, warm, and smelled like copper and old dishwater. The door to the guest room was unlatched. Just a tiny crack of blackness showing against the white trim. My heart was thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat, a physical pulse that made it hard to swallow. I pushed the door open with the head of the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the far wall. The room was a mess. Not the kind of mess I'd left it in either. The boxes had been shredded. Not opened, not rifled through, shredded. Corrugated cardboard was torn into long, jagged strips that looked like they'd been processed through a wood chipper. And in the center of the room, sitting on top of my old treadmill, was a pile of clothes. My clothes. I'd kept a bag of stuff to donate in there, and something had pulled every single item out. They were arranged in a circle, soaked in that same dark, viscous fluid. I heard a breath. It wasn't a human breath. It sounded like air being forced through a wet sponge. Ich-ich-ich-ich-ich-ich. Ich-ich-ich-ich-ich-ich. It was coming from the closet. I should have run. I know that now. I should have just bolted out the front door and never looked back. But you get this weird, morbid curiosity when you're terrified in your own home. You feel like you have to know. I swung the light toward the closet, and for a split second, I saw it. It was pale, the kind of white you only see on the underside of a dead fish. It was thin, impossibly thin, with joints that seemed to bend in the wrong directions. It was hunched over, its spine pressed against the ceiling of the closet, its long, needle-like fingers buried in the drywall for grip. It didn't have a face, not really. Just a slit where a mouth should be and skin pulled so tight over its skull that you could see the jagged edges of the bone beneath. It didn't scream. It didn't long. It just slid. It dropped from the ceiling with that same wet thud and vanished into the shadows behind the mountain of shredded cardboard. I didn't stay to see where it went. I turned and sprinted. I hit the stairs so hard I nearly broke my ankle, flew through the living room, and didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine roaring. I called the police, obviously. I told them someone had broken in. When they got there, they found the house exactly how I described it, but the thing was gone. They found the oil I'd seen. The lead officer, a guy who looked like he'd seen everything, turned pale when he saw the guest room. He told me it looked like a predatory nesting site. But here's the part that actually keeps me awake, the part that the police couldn't explain. They did a sweep of the whole house, including the crawl space and the attic. They didn't find the creature. What they found instead were the remains of my neighbor's golden retriever, Bailey. She'd been missing for 3 days. She wasn't just dead, she'd been emptied. It was like something had unzipped her from the inside out, leaving nothing but the fur and the larger bones, polished clean. No blood on the carpet. No mess. Just a hollowed-out shell tucked neatly under the guest room bed. The police think it was a person. Some kind of sick, twisted transient with a fixation on taxidermy or ritualistic killing. They told me to change the locks and get a security system. They said the fluid was a mix of animal fats and some kind of digestive enzyme they couldn't fully identify. They tried to make it sound like a crime, a human crime. I stayed at a motel for a week. I had a security team come out and bolt that skylight shut. They installed bars over the glass and put motion sensor lights in every room. I thought I was safe. I moved back in because I couldn't afford to just abandon my mortgage. For 2 days, it was quiet. Then, last night happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that never comes easily anymore. The house was silent. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching. It wasn't coming from the guest room. It was coming from the wall right behind my headboard. Scritch, slide. Scritch, slide. It was moving inside the drywall. I could hear its long, needle-thin fingers dragging against the wooden studs. It wasn't trying to get in through the windows anymore. It had realized that the house was just a series of hollow boxes, and it was moving through the veins of the building. I sat up, freezing, my breath hitching in my chest. And then I looked up at the vent for the central heating, the one right above my bed. The slats are narrow, barely an inch wide. But as I watched, a thick, dark drop of that copper-smelling fluid fell through the vent. It landed on my white duvet with a heavy splat. I looked closer, my eyes straining in the dark. Behind the metal grating of the vent, I saw something pale move. A sliver of white skin. And then, a sound. It wasn't the wet sponge breathing this time. It was a voice. Or a mimicry of one. It sounded like a recording played at half speed, distorted and metallic, but it was unmistakably my own voice. It opened the window, the thing whispered from inside the duct. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't grab my shoes. I ran out of that house in my pajamas and I haven't been back since. I'm sitting in a 24-hour diner right now, writing this out because I feel like if I don't tell someone, I'm going to lose my mind. The police went back today. They tore the wall open behind my bed. They found tunnels. Not mouse holes, tunnels the size of a human torso, carved through. The insulation and the studs. They found more shells in there. Stray cats, a couple of possums, and clothes. More of my clothes, shredded and soaked in that stuff, used to line the tunnels like a nest. But they didn't find the thing. I'm staying at my sister's place now. She lives in a high-rise apartment on the 12th floor. No skylights. No crawl spaces. Just concrete and steel. I thought I'd feel better. But about an hour ago, I was brushing my teeth and I looked up at the ceiling fan. There was a smear of dark, tacky fluid on one of the blades. And when I turned the light off to go to bed, I swear I heard the sound of someone dragging a raw steak across the floor in the hallway. It doesn't want the house. It doesn't want the neighborhood. It's not a transient and it's not a person. It's something that learned how to get in, and now that it knows my scent, now that it's tasted my life, it doesn't need an open window anymore. I'm looking at the vent in this diner right now. It's small, maybe 4 inches wide. I think I see something white moving behind the slats.
Next story.
Some debts are paid in skin. Don't look up.
You know that hardware store on the edge of town? The one with the flickering sign that's been missing though for 3 years? I used to work there. It was a dead-end job, literally, but it paid the bills. Most people think hardware stores are boring places filled with the smell of sawdust and lawnmowers, but after what happened to Elias, I can't even look at a screwdriver without feeling my stomach do a slow, sick flip. This wasn't some campfire ghost story. There were no ghosts. Just cold, heavy steel and the kind of biological mess that makes you realize how fragile a human body actually is. Elias was a good guy, maybe a bit too comfortable around the heavy machinery. He'd been there 10 years and treated the industrial pipe threaders and wood chippers like they were old friends. It was a Tuesday night, about 20 minutes before closing. The store was that specific kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of the industrial refrigerators from 2 aisles over. I was over in electrical, tidying up some wire spools, when I heard the sound. It wasn't a scream. Not at first. It was a wet, heavy thunk, followed by the high-pitched whine of a motor straining against something it wasn't designed to cut. I ran toward aisle 9, the plumbing and heavy tool section, and the smell hit me before I saw him. It was the scent of hot copper and burnt hair. Elias had been working on the heavy-duty industrial shredder we used for breaking down scrap metal and thick PVC. The safety guard was off. He always said it got in the way of his flow. When I rounded the corner, I saw him slumped over the intake hopper. His sleeve, a thick flannel, had snagged on the primary drive gear. I watched his arm get pulled in. It didn't happen fast like in the movies. It was agonizingly slow. The machine groaned, its steel teeth grinding against the radius and ulna bones in his forearm. I heard them snap, a sound like dry kindling breaking under a boot, and then a wet, squelching sound of muscle being peeled away from the bone. He finally screamed then. It was a sound that didn't even seem human. It was a high, thin whistle of pure, unadulterated agony. I lunged for the emergency stop button, but the plastic casing was cracked and jammed. I hit it again and again, my palms bruising against the red button, but the machine just kept humming, kept chewing. By the time I found a heavy wrench to jam into the gears, Elias's shoulder was already being pulled into the mouth of the hopper. The teeth were dull, which made it so much worse. They didn't slice, they gnashed. I saw his collarbone shatter, the white splinters of bone piercing through the skin like jagged teeth. Blood wasn't just leaking out, it was pulsing in rhythm with his terrified heart, spraying across the yellow caution tape on the floor in long, dark ribbons. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vibrating in his skull. He tried to say something, but as the machine dragged his chest cavity into the intake, his lungs collapsed. A thick, frothy mixture of blood and bile bubbled out of his mouth. I could see the internal mechanisms of the shredder through the open wound in his side. The steel rollers were coated in a thick, grayish-pink paste, bits of fat, denim, and shredded organs. The sound, man, the sound is what stays with me. It was the sound of a person being turned into a liquid. Every time a gear turned, there was a wet pop as another joint was dislocated or another organ was punctured. The shredder finally stalled when it hit his skull. There was a sickening crunch, like someone stepping on a large, hollow gourd, and then silence. Just the smell of grease and the slow drip, drip, drip of fluid hitting the concrete floor. I stood there in the dark aisle, staring at what was left. It wasn't Elias anymore. It was just a heap of shredded meat and jagged bone fragments caught in a machine. His left eye was sitting on the edge of the hopper, staring at nothing, still connected by a thin, red string of optic nerve. The police came, of course. They called it a tragic industrial accident. They cleaned it up with bleach and sawdust, but you can't ever really clean that up. I went back a week later to pick up my final paycheck. The store was open, and people were walking up and down aisle 9, looking for copper fittings and PVC glue, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath their boots was still stained dark in the cracks of the concrete. I walked past the machine. It had been repaired, the safety guard replaced, the steel teeth scrubbed bright and silver. But as I stood there, I swear I could hear a faint, metallic grinding coming from inside the motor. And then I saw it. Tucked deep into the corner of the intake hopper, where the cleaning brushes couldn't reach, was a single human molar. It was cracked down the middle, stained a deep, rusty brown. I didn't take the paycheck. I just turned and walked out. Now, every time I'm in a store and I hear the sound of a motor starting up, or the smell of hot metal hits my nose, I see Elias's face. I see the way his skin stretched until it popped. I think about how easy it is for the world to just chew you up. We're all just soft things living in a world of hard edges, and eventually the gears catch up to everyone. I heard they hired a new guy for the night shift last week. A young kid eager to work. I wonder if they told him why the safety guard on the shredder is brand new. I wonder if he notices the way the air in aisle 9 feels heavy and wet, even when the AC is on full blast. Probably not. Not until he feels that first little tug on his sleeve.
Next story.
Some debts are paid in skin. Don't look up.
Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.